Huh.
We've come a long way. The 9 games I've talked about, it's not enough to say that they're good games or even great games. These are games that help shape who I am as a YouTuber, who I am as a person. Without these 10 games, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And yeah, there are tons of other games that I want to talk about, but, well, I did put the cap at 10, didn't I? So here we are, my number 1, my favorite game of all time. If you've watched this channel long enough, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what it is, but, well, I had it set in stone before I even started the YouTube channel. One of my greatest childhood joys was walking around this trail and seeing how it connects to other neighborhoods and other parks. It was something that sort of put my mind at ease when things got too heavy or stressful. And that's what makes this number 1 game so special. When things are getting too stressful, I can pop this game in and it'll put my mind at ease. It's like slipping on a comfortable pair of shoes, or slipping into bed even. And that's why Metroid Prime is my favorite game of all time. Look at any of the 9 games I've covered before this, and you can see just a little bit of Metroid Prime in there. Half-Life 2's dark, foreboding atmosphere, Super Mario 64's mastery over the third dimension, Chrono Trigger's tight and slim design philosophy, Snake Eater's belt of wonderful puzzle-solving toys, Portal's educational and experimental level design, Shadow of the Colossus' solemnity, Castlevania's smart use of gameplay-induced horror, Deus Ex's memorable locales, and of course, Undertale's playful sense of mystery. But even if Metroid Prime shares all of those values, it's still gotta feel all its own. There's no other game quite like Metroid Prime. I discovered this game at the age of 10, after my brother had brought it home from a local Blockbuster, God rest their souls. Now, consider my gaming palette up to that point. I had grown up on games like Super Mario Sunshine, Paper Mario, Pokemon, Rogue Squadron 2, and other very kid-friendly Nintendo games. We popped the disc into our GameCube, and this is what we saw. I had never seen a game begin like that before or since. Metroid Prime's first half hour is so dark and moody, which was so unlike anything else I had ever played at the time. It's spine-chilling. You go through this derelict space station wondering what the hell happened here. And while you do have a scan visor that gives you some clues, the cause of the damage here is still very foreign and alien. And herein lies the point that separates Prime from everything else in the series, or even other games in general. There is evil in this world, but before you can vanquish it or destroy it, you have to find it first. That's just not something you see in a lot of stories. It's not even something I saw in a lot of stories when I was a kid. Metroid Prime's first priority is to establish its world, and then let the player discover more and more of it until they find an antagonist. And you have to keep in mind that when I was a kid, many movies and games were very quick to give us an easily identifiable bad guy. You often see them in the first few minutes gloating about their evil plan and just being a jerk to people. But when you first see the main antagonists in this game, they're on this station, and they're not in good shape. They're almost sympathetic. Yeah, they shoot at you, but they're bleeding and dying all around you. A good comparison, I feel, is Super Metroid. At the beginning of Super Metroid, the player is explicitly told the backstory of the last few Metroid games, and that Samus has something at stake when the space station is attacked, the baby Metroid. When Ridley kidnaps that Metroid, Samus has a personal mission to go to Zebes and find the baby. But there's no narration at the beginning of Metroid Prime. There are a couple pirate logs you can scan about experiments on the vessel, but almost nothing involving Samus except for a brief explanation of the first game's events. The first game, by the way, being an NES game back before developers could fit in-depth stories onto small cartridges. In Super Metroid, your motivation for exploring Zebes was to find the baby Metroid and keep the pirates from exploiting it. But in Prime, your only motivation is, hey, that dragon looks really cool. I bet I should go down and see where it's going. I mean, those were my thoughts back then. And I should have known when I was a kid that Talon 4 had way more cool stuff than that. That's the cool thing about a lack of exposition at the beginning. It lets the player soak in the world that much more. If you simply arrived on the planet with a mission in mind, then you wouldn't have to gauge the environment or the lore in order to find a way. Oh, and by the way, if you're playing this game for the first time, turn off the hint system. It's much better that way. Now, don't get me wrong. Metroid Prime, like many Metroidvanias, is at its heart a linear game. The game is expecting you to go down a set, specific path for like 90% of the game. But that's another thing about Metroidvanias. They give the illusion of freedom, and that's what makes them interesting and cool to me. When you arrive on Talon 4, there are like 3 different ways you can go. Of course, 2 of them are temporary dead ends, but they still get stuck in your head. This is a game that expects you to take mental notes on every dead end you come across, because there might be something worth discovering. When you walk over here, you think, I need to find something that lets me jump higher in water before I can go this way. Better check the other routes out. Of course, Samus has a scan visor, and I understand why it rubs some people the wrong way. There's a lot of reading you're going to have to do if you have any hope of knowing what's going on. But I always liked it. Not only does it give you hints on what kind of items you need to progress in certain directions, but using it is how you discover the lost story of the Chozo, and the current goings-on of the pirates on the surface. As they say, there is evil in this world, but you have to find it first. I always treat every log entry like any other item in this game. I can't call it 100% completion unless I can look into my logbook and see the whole story laid bare. And that's how Retro made their hint system so fun. Yes, you have to pull up your scan visor to learn about how to progress occasionally, but you never know when you'll be fed an interesting story tidbit or an entertaining backstory for a particular boss or enemy. Rather than just spoon-feeding the story to you like any other game would, Metroid Prime makes you look for the story just like you would an energy tank or a missile pack. It ties the story to the same exploration mechanics that make the main game cool, and I really wish more games would do that. And by the way, I have to give props to Retro for how they revamped the mechanics for the third dimension. This isn't something I fully appreciated until much later, when I had a few other Metroid games under my belt, but man, it's really impressive. Rather than adhering to the grid-like structure of previous Metroid games, they created this massive world where every single room feels distinct. Nothing feels cut and paste in here. Every room has its own little story. Instead of exploring for items and stuff like I would in Super Metroid or Axiom Verge, I feel like I'm exploring because I genuinely want to see what the game has in store next. I want to see what kind of stuff is in this room up here at the top of the great tree behind this red door. Not because I know there's a missile expansion in there, but because I don't know, and I genuinely want to know. That desire and curiosity also applies to the enemies and the combat too. Again, going back to the Super Metroid comparison, when I see a giant space dragon fly down to a nearby planet, I don't want to go after it because it kidnapped a special living baby MacGuffin. I want to go after it because it's a freaking space pirate dragon cyborg. What 10-year-old isn't going to think that's cool? I sure did. Of course, there's a long journey between then and the actual fight against said dragon cyborg, but that's fine. Because as we mentioned before, there's lots of cool storytelling and lore to keep you intrigued until then. Oh, and combat. I should get back on topic. The combat in this game is superb. Of course, if you've played any first-person console game in the past decade, you're going to think that Metroid Prime's controls aren't very good. They feel more Resident Evil 4 or GoldenEye than Halo. But then again, I was 10 years old. I didn't know any better back then. I decided to do something special when I recorded this footage though. Veteran viewers of my channel know that I have the Metroid Prime Trilogy disc, but I decided to pick up the GameCube version just to see how the controls held up, and they do. It's weird at first, of course, but precision aiming isn't really necessary. Being able to lock onto enemies makes it more like Ocarina of Time than something like Call of Duty. Actually, now that I think about it, yeah, Prime's combat does riff a lot off of the 3D Zelda games. With the lock-on, you're able to quickly circle strafe, jump, charge up shots, fire homing missiles. It's complicated. A lot more complicated than Super Metroid, in fact, where it was as simple as shooting and jumping. I do suppose that means Prime inherits a lot of problems that 3D Zelda games have, namely that a lot of the encounters are based on waiting. But it's not as prevalent in Prime, and rather than just focusing on one item, a lot of the bosses in Prime feel like more of a general final exam. When you get to the end of the Chozo Ruins and fight Flagra, you need to use almost every tool you've acquired up to that point. You need missiles to quickly get the solar generators down, charge shots and/or more missiles to stun it, Morph Ball to access its weakness, and bombs to actually hurt it. Same thing goes for Thardus and the Omega Pirate and Ridley, and especially the final boss. Instead of testing you on the particular tools that you got in that particular area, every fight feels like it's testing you on everything you know so far. The great level design, though, helps you learn. I tend to think of every item in this game as a key that unlocks a certain kind of door. As we mentioned earlier, you need this key, the gravity suit, to open this door, the underwater ledge that leads to the crashed frigate. And unlike a lot of recent Zelda games, the items you get feel like treasures that you can always find a use for. Again, that's par for the course with Metroidvanias, but it's a design quirk that I've always loved. Getting a new power-up always gets my head spinning and thinking back to previous doors that I can now unlock. I remember those doors thanks to the memorable level design and storytelling contained within, and the feeling when you finally unlock them is so incredible. That feeling is especially strong in Metroid Prime because of the environmental storytelling, and when you finally get the last item, the Phazon suit, at the end of the game, you feel powerful. You can easily breeze through areas that once gave you a lot of trouble. That's why I actually think it was so ingenious to send players on a scavenger hunt at the very end. A lot of people don't like this final stretch of the game, and you'll hear those same people complain that it kills the pacing. But does it? Does it really? I feel like the final artifact hunt is a fantastic way to cap off the adventure. Like the bosses, every artifact is like an exam. It's a test of your knowledge of the world, and how your newfound endgame abilities will be able to interact with it. It's a way for the game to say, you think you know this world? Have you really been paying attention? Prove it. None of them are hard to find, except for this one in Phendrana's Edge, which, okay, is kind of obtuse, but they challenge you to rethink some of the more iconic rooms in the game. They ask you to remember certain moments over the course of your adventure, and give you one last puzzle in each of those areas to solve with your newfangled gear. It's a different kind of trial that isn't straight up combat. It's a new way of looking at what an endgame challenge is supposed to be. Yes, there are 2 final bosses that you fight after getting all the artifacts, and yes, a few of the artifacts are very combat-centric, but overall they represent what makes Metroid Prime so thematically different from other games of its caliber. Think of other popular games that fit the same general mold as Prime. Ocarina of Time, Arkham Asylum, Dark Souls, stuff like that. What do they expect you to do before you finish the game? They expect you to fight a certain number of bosses. They may disguise this in the form of medallions, or Lord Souls, or, well, famous Batman villains, but they're all boss fights. They want you to fight certain people before you're allowed to fight the world's ultimate evil, be it Ganon, Lord Gwyn, or the lamest incarnation of the Joker that anyone will ever see, Sick Burn. Metroid Prime doesn't ask this of you. It asks you for great, ancient treasures that you must find through wit and exploration. It asks you to remember every area you visit. Remember the story of the Chozo and the evils of the dark creatures exploiting the planet. It asks you not necessarily to fight, but to think of the game world in new and interesting ways. Before you're allowed to fight that giant space pirate dragon cyborg you saw at the beginning of the game, you must explore and learn from an ancient civilization's mistakes and correct their wrongs. Of course, it never explicitly tells you any of this. You must figure it out on your own. You need to open your scan visor and let yourself get lost in Talon 4's maze-like storytelling and structure. You need to be just as willing to find this world's secrets as the world is to show them to you. Up to that point, when I was 10 years old, I wasn't expected to do that in any game I had played before. I was expected to win, beat the Elite Four, get first place, rescue the princess. When I played Prime, however, I wasn't given a carrot to follow for the entire game. Yes, the giant space pirate dragon cyborg was a neat incentive, but that's not the only reason I found myself dwelling the depths of Talon 4. I did so for the story and the secrets. Games that expect that kind of player behavior don't come out often. Consumers, especially busy adults like myself, want a quick game that they can finish over the course of a weekend, or in between shifts. When you're exhausted from school or work, how can you be expected to play something that asks so much from its audience? But that's the very reason this game has stood out to me from the first time I played it more than a decade ago to this very day. It was the first game that didn't ask me to win. It simply gave me its hand and said, I have something to show you. You must pay attention and be willing to think outside the box. But trust me, it will stick with you. At the start of the last video, I mentioned that we tend to view our favorite video games with a rosy, nostalgic tint. We tend to remember games that we played in our childhoods as better than when we really first played them. But every time I play through Metroid Prime, I'm reminded that that isn't always the case. I mean, yeah, there are probably games that fit into Prime's mold much better than, say, Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but still, you never forget your first. Metroid Prime has crafted me into the person that I am today over the course of years and years and years and years. It taught me that inquisitiveness and curiosity aren't just childlike traits, but real, valuable traits that I can carry over today, and I've stood by that ever since. Anytime I'm looking for a new game to play, or new content to create, or really just any new path to follow, I'm reminded of the kind of person that Prime molded me into over all those years. And yeah, I suppose that would be enough to make any game anybody's favorite game of all time. And I really don't mean to diminish any of the 9 games that came before this one. These all shaped me into who I am in a certain way. But, as I said before, you never forget your first. And Prime is as early as you can get for me. I suppose I can't stop now, can I? There are tons of games out there, future and past, that are going to continue to shape me into a different person. So, well, this trail isn't going to hike itself. I'll see you next time. guys, thank you so much for sticking with me all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this mini-series, I have some good news. I did cap the list at 10 to make sure I didn't just ramble on and on and on, because I've got so many other games that have influenced me so much. But why not cover those games? I figure we may as well do some honorable mentions, right? So I'll have more details in a week or so, but until then, please subscribe, please like the videos if you liked them, and stay tuned for more of the Favorite Games Project. Until then, well, may as well let these credits roll, huh?